Okay, I officially have 12:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I've hit record. And I realized when I sent the email today that I forgot to add the attachment of the recording from last week, so I'll resend that as well. So quick startup. So I'm Sarah Havens, and field specialist in natural resources within U Extension, and I facilitate the Women Owning Woodland program in Missouri. So this is our program that we are working on developing to provide learning opportunities to women landowners and woodland enthusiasts. We organize field days, lunch and learns, classes, partner with as many folks as possible for us to provide those experiences, especially now we're doing a little bit more face-to-face moving forward. There also is a National Women Owning Woodland, so I should put that on this slide. If you're ever looking for events, even in other states, they get posted on that national page. So just kind of for your own information. Also a Facebook page we have that provides networking opportunities, and I just try to post anything new and exciting coming up that's usually within the natural resources field. Upcoming events. And so February 22nd, March 1st, and March 8th. So we already had the first one, but we're doing a Winter Woodland Steward webinar. So the first one was Cash for Carbon, and it is recorded, and you can still register for these other events. March 1st will be Forest Health, and Robbie Deerhoff from NBC will be talking about forest health. And March 8th is going to be Wildlife Habitat for Non-Game Wildlife, and that will be with Brian McGowan, who's from Purdue Extension. So again, registration is still open for those. March 12th, I will be holding, I think, my third and final tree sugaring workshop for the year at WordAct. March 17th, this is when I just put the registration out for today and very excited about. So we're gonna learn to identify and manage invasive species at Merrimack Spring Park, which is in St. James, Missouri. So we have multiple partners helping on this one, but Merrimack has a management plan in place, and they have identified invasive species that need to be managed. So we're going to spend the morning talking about identification and management, and then we're going to let participants have an opportunity to try out some of those hands-on management pieces we talked about to kind of help out Merrimack Spring Park, but also to get hands-on experience on someone else's property. Then Mondays in March, the Wild Lunch and Learns will move to Mondays. And so March 7th will be our first one. So we will skip a lunch and learn next week. So just heads up on that. There will not be one next week because the way kind of the dates fall. But we will move to Mondays. I have a couple different, I just made the announcement for this one, and I'll put out the topics. Katie Candler will join us. She's a horticulture specialist from University of Missouri Extension. So she's going to join us on the 21st to talk about planting natives. And we're going to do our spring flower identification as one of our other ones. And then I also have the poison plants and pests again. So this is helping identify plants that can cause us to itch or harm, and then also trying to avoid ticks, chiggers, and other nuisances. And then April 29th is our Women Owning Woodland, Women Caring for the Land workshop at Shawnee Reserve. And this one, and I think Kim joined us today, but this one's on our calendar, but registration is not open for this yet. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to talk about forest stand improvement today. You also will sometimes see this referred to as timber stand improvement. So historically, we called it timber stand improvement because most of our forestry practices really revolved around us producing timber as a product. As we kind of move forward in our thinking about our forestry practices, and we're not just managing strictly for timber, we've started to use the term forest stand improvement just so it sounds less product oriented. But either is correct, and you can say TSI or FSI to a forester and they will know what you were talking about. So these are what we call pre-commercial treatments. And so this means that we aren't generally going to get anything that has any commercial value off with this thinning. We are just thinning strictly for the health and regeneration of our forest. And so this is, and usually meets a specific purpose. A lot of times this objective is going to be improved timber. So we know that if trees are stocked too heavily, they won't grow very fast. And so they aren't going to produce timber in the near future if we don't kind of help them along. We also do this for forest health. So just like anything, if you have too many trees using up all those resources in an area, this can lead to a decline in overall health and make them more susceptible to diseases and insects. So by thinning, we actually can improve forest health and prevent the potential spread or increase in their susceptibility to those things. So, and then also for wildlife habitat. So most of us, we do like to walk through a nice open forest. However, our wildlife do not like that for hiding, for food sources. So we thin so that we can open up the understory a little, brush it up a little, allow for some of those understory species to grow, and this improves that habitat for wildlife. Trees within a stand that are desirable species, age, class, and form are the ones that we keep. And then those that compete with those trees are the ones that we are going to cut out or cull out. So this includes looking, so a really easy starting point, especially for timber stand improvement or forest stand improvement, is to pull out the trees that perhaps aren't the ones that you desire to have in your forest. So this might include ones that aren't great for wildlife, for example. So oak trees are really great for wildlife because they provide acorns, which is a really valuable source of nutrition. They also have a lot of value as a timber tree. And so if I was going through to do a timber stand improvement, I might start by pulling out or cutting or thinning more of, if I had oak hickory mix, by taking out more of the hickories. I'd want to leave some hickories for diversity's sake, but perhaps those would be the ones I'd start by removing. Or if I have other species that are, again, less desirable, such as cedars, those are ones we can start with. If we're going on form, we might find oaks that have really low forks. Double trees are sometimes the ones that are good to remove with our thinnings because they are sharing a root system and therefore sharing resources, and they aren't going to grow from a timber perspective. They're not going to get as large as fast as a single tree using that same root system. So that's kind of where our mind goes when we're thinking about forest stand improvement and when we're approaching it. By removing some of those trees, again, it releases our desirable trees from as much competition. It'll increase their growth rates, and it allows us to have kind of an influence on the shape of the forest that we're developing. So when we start with thinning, excuse me, we focus on removing poor growing stock while leaving good trees across the stand. So just kind of an example of this, if you want to picture what a thinning looks like. And this is taken out of a forest textbook, but here's our unthinned stand. So again, just kind of a mix of trees that are very close together. And then, especially if you've had a management plan written, you'll sometimes see a prescription for a thinning, and it'll use these terms of light thinning, moderate thinning, and heavy thinning. So this is just kind of an illustration of what that looks like as far as what we're removing. Oftentimes in Missouri, a lot of times, especially if you have oak hickory, those thinnings that they recommend, not require, are going to be more moderate. And they'll also sometimes give you things like basal area to remove. So this is going to be the number of trees per 10th acre that you should be removing. So, and just an example of why we thin. So here's a tree pre-thinning and then post-thinning. So you can see that just by removing some of that competition and improving on growing conditions, this tree started to grow a lot faster. So by favoring the development of selected trees in a hardwood stand, you can meet a wide variety of management objectives. So this includes wildlife habitat, recreation, timber value, aesthetic beauty, and species diversity. So, and some people think, oh, I'm cutting out the trees is going to make it look really terrible underneath there. Well, this really actually opens that understory for things like forbs that are in the on the forest floor to get a little bit of sunlight. So you'll actually see usually an increase in things like wildflowers, warm season grasses that tend to find their way in the understory. So it can improve that value. And really, when we're thinning, we're cutting smaller trees, so we don't have nearly as much biological matter to break down. And so usually we don't really see the effects, or we don't see the residual from thinning for as long as we do from like a timber sale, for example. We sometimes, so this is also called a crop tree release. So sometimes early in a timber stand's life, we'll pick out certain trees that those are going to be our ones that we know we want to get them to maturity because they have really good form, great genetics, they're valuable for wildlife. And so those are sometimes called our crop trees. And then we'll do crop tree releases. So we'll go through and release other trees around them so that they can stay, again, getting full sunlight, lots of water and nutrients from the soil. And so we'll do this throughout their lifetime. In some cases, we'll do crop tree release more than once during that life of the woodland. So again, an intermediate silvicultural treatment intended to provide our increased growing space to selected trees by removing crown competition from adjacent trees. And how do we approach this? So we, again, while the term crop tree suggests a tree that's been selected for future harvest, we can apply it to other trees that we want to, keep for things like wildlife, aesthetics. So, we have certain trees that, I prefer the look of a white oak, or I really like the look of this red oak. So we might be retaining them for things other than future harvest, but at the same time, thinking about future harvest doesn't hurt either. It's a pretty simple concept, but you want to keep two things in mind. You want to understand how crop trees help meet your management objectives. So it might have been in January we talked about management plans, but we talked about objectives and having management objectives for your forest. And so understanding what you are managing forest for. So do you want to have a timber sale? Are you more just planning to, use your property for recreation? Do you want to have more wildlife? Which type of wildlife do you want? Are you managing for deer and turkey? Are you thinking something else? So it's important to understand the crop trees that you leave, how those are helping you meet your management objectives. I have, to be honest, met a landowner once that he really liked the squirrel hunt. Like that was his favorite thing to do. And so many of his crop trees that he left were hickories because those were, more attractive to squirrels. And so again, those were the crop trees that met his objectives. The other, concept you want to keep in mind here is that we're reducing competition for site resources around crop trees because we want to enhance their vigor and development. So this is sometimes the hardest part, especially when landowners are doing TSI on their own, is it's sometimes hard to decide which ones you want to keep and which ones you want to cut. So if you pick your crop trees, you do have to make sure you open it on at least 3 sides. So if we do TSI and we don't open up enough on our crop trees, there's still a benefit to doing it, but we aren't getting the full benefit from the work that we're putting in. So again, these are ones that, again, from a forestry and a wildlife perspective, these are ones we consider, desirable species. So oak, of course, have great value for wildlife, but also for timber. And so these are kind of examples of like 2 very desirable trees that I would want to have in my forest. So I have, nice, tall, straight, white oak in both of these pictures. And they are like the one that you can see on the right. It's got like a really nice full canopy. The fork isn't too low. It looks really healthy, so we don't have many branches that are dying back. So those are good ones to leave as our crop trees. Excuse me. Other ones to think about removing, and we see this particularly a lot in Ozark forests. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all of the Ozarks were pretty much clear cut. And so we see some really old forests, and then we also see some that were kind of cleared or cut completely or cut very heavily in the 1940s, 1950s. So like we had that first crop kind of regenerate and then another timber sale that came through. And so I will visit properties and see a lot of multiple stemmed trees. And this often happens from those timber sales without any post timber sale work. So oaks are great stump sprouters. So if we cut an oak, we often have multiple stump sprouts that come up. And this is like a great thing for our oak regeneration because they already have that really developed root system, which helps them get a head start. Unfortunately, if we don't do some of our like post timber sale practices, so more than a couple, probably 10 years after a timber sale, it's beneficial to go back through and anything that was that is cut and starting to regenerate, particularly if we have multiple stump sprouts, it's good to pick the best one and cut the others so we have single trees. Otherwise, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, this is what we end up with is clumps of trees. So you can, at this point, so in particular on this one that you see on the left, we could pick the best of these trees and then cut the other two. In some cases, depending what the rest of our forest looks like, it's best to just take out all three and then go from there as far as regeneration. And this is simply because it can be tricky and we can introduce like insects and diseases to the single one that we leave. If we cut it cleanly, it seals completely over and then it will start new sprouts kind of from fresh areas. Other trees to remove are these ones that have really low forks on the bole. And this is because they are more susceptible to crown breakage. So if like, windstorm, tornado, ice storm comes through, these are ones that are going to be more susceptible to breaking. And then we lose, again, the benefits of that tree. And then also, if you look at this tree, it does not have quite as much value in its stem. So as soon as it forks, we are gonna, if we're thinking from a timber perspective, we're only gonna have the clean wood that's below that fork. So it's gonna have less board footage in it. I'm looking at this just from kind of like our goal, if you will. So once we've picked a crop tree, so sometimes it's beneficial to go through and flag the trees that you want to keep as your crop trees and work from that direction. And so here's like the one I know, like, it's the tree species that I prefer for my property. It has good health, good vigor. That's the one I want to save. So I'm going to go and it's easier to look at this sometimes from above than it is when we're on the ground. But what you want to do is look up and see which ones share and touch the canopy of the one you want to keep. So ideally, we will clear it completely open so it's going to get sunlight on all sides, and this is going to give it its best increase in sunlight for continued growth. So this is kind of what we're looking for. So you can see this tree is open now on all sides, and there's again a little bit of daylight in between its closest canopy. We don't always have to be as harsh, but it is ideal. And if we do release them, at least on three sides is our best bet. We also don't have to worry about taking out understory trees. So things like dogwood, redbud, downy hawthorn, any of those trees that grow in the understory. So they do use resources from the soil. but it has been found that sunlight is actually really our biggest limiting factor when it comes to trees. And so we don't usually worry too much about the understory species competing with our canopy trees or our crop trees, so those can stay in place. What we're looking to do is make sure the canopy is open to a lot of sunlight. So again, this is another kind of look at that. So other also subordinate trees or overtopped or weak trees, excuse me again, they don't need to be removed because they, like in this picture, our crop tree is getting all of that sunlight, and those other ones that are underneath it, they aren't interfering with that. If you're doing TSI yourself, this is a practice you can hire someone for, and all of our TSI contractors are pretty familiar with like the terminology. So if your plan says remove 30 basal area per acre, they are going to know how to implement that, and you don't have to mark your trees yourself. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold and it has been rough. But if you're doing it yourself, it doesn't hurt to go out and mark your trees, the ones you want to keep, the ones you want to remove. And this gives you a chance to take a look at things. Again, we say look at it twice, cut once, because it's kind of like cutting like wood for a construction project. Like you want to measure twice and only cut once because you can't put it back together. And so this also gives you an idea of kind of what it's going to look like when you're done. And so here's an example of one we marked. So again, kind of a nice straight white oak there that we like. And then we're removing, like these are two hickories right here and a black oak that's right there. So you know, again, want to kind of look at it. And this gives you a chance to, again, see what you're doing. And then also, this is easier. I don't know if anyone's run a chainsaw for any period of time, but it is exhausting and it's hard to make decisions about trees that you're leaving and keeping, and also do all your thought processes for running the chainsaw. Again, it can be done. It just makes it a little bit easier, and you don't have so many things you're thinking on. So again, here's kind of a normal crop tree selection. So we've marked our green ones, and then this would be our typical crown touching, you know, releasing on 3 to 4 sides. And then this one would be an incorrect. So if we want to reduce the amount of trees that we're removing, you can see that, so this one already has a really large canopy, and so it can be kind of left open, whereas our smaller ones that might not have as much in the canopy, we can adjust those so that they are getting the 3 to 4 sides. Oftentimes you'll hear from foresters that once the stand gets past a certain age, even TSI is not enough to help it because our older trees don't put on a lot of growth. However, we've been in the field and we have seen evidence that even older trees have some room to increase their growth with a thinning of sorts. So this one again is proof. You can see pretty close rings there. And then this is when we did a thinning in that stand. And then this is the growth that we saw after. So this tree, even though it was probably older when we did this thinning, and that's what we run into in Missouri, is that, again, since we, most of our regenerating forests are the same age, so they usually are all cut at the same time, and then they end up being the same age. So it's sometimes hard to come in and do these thinnings because our trees are older, but we have found that still can benefit them. Now the technical side. So how to kill unwanted trees. So there's a couple different ways to go about doing timber stand improvement. So there's what we call girdling. So, and this is done with a chainsaw, and we cut rings, usually a double ring. And then if we really want to make sure that tree is dead, we'll treat it with an herbicide on those rings that we girdled. We can also do something called hack and squirt. And this is done by cutting pieces of the bark away so that we expose the cambium layer, and then treating that with an herbicide. So again, oh, I jumped the gun, I always do. So chainsaw girdling. And we treat with an herbicide because if we do not, in some cases, these trees will sprout from where we girdled. It also may be an undesirable species that we don't want to regenerate, so it would stump sprout if it's not treated with an herbicide. So especially like so down in the Ozarks, we have a lot of common buckthorn that sometimes gets removed this way, and we don't want it to come back. When you get up to northern Missouri, they have a lot of ironwood in the understory, and we'll TSI some of that ironwood out so it doesn't compete, and we don't want it to come back because we want oaks to regenerate in that understory. With girdling, you can leave the tree standing. For safety purposes, you don't want to girdle and leave trees like close to paths, close to deer stands, close to anywhere where those trees will become a hazard. They do tend to break down pretty easily on their own and come down in bits and pieces that are not as dangerous as you would think. However, again, for safety purposes, it's good to not leave them around places that you'll be traveling or spending much time. We can also, again, just cut the stump completely, and to save on herbicide costs. So here they cut and treated the whole stump. Well, actually the living part of the tree is just this cambium layer. And so you can get away with just treating that outer layer with an herbicide. And then this is heartwood, so it's already, it's not living, so it doesn't have any vascularization to it. So it's not going to take any herbicide up. So again, kind of save money. And again, we treat with herbicide when we don't want any stump sprouts. So if we want something to be removed completely from our forest, we would treat it with an herbicide. Another method to remove trees that is still labor intensive, but not as hard as running a chainsaw all day is basal bark treatment. And this works better in northern Missouri. In particular, we do TSI that sometimes focuses on getting rid of sugar maple from the forest, because they do compete pretty good with oak trees. And so we will thin those out of the forest. And this is basal bark treatment. This is another method you can use on some of our invasive species, but our herbicide gets mixed with an oil, and then this gets applied to kind of the lower 18 inches of a tree. Usually works best also on trees that are 6 inches in diameter or less, but that oil helps that herbicide be absorbed by the tree, and then it will kill it over time. Hack and squirt. So this one I talked about just a little bit, and there's a couple different ways. So it can be this can be a very basic treatment. They do make a hypodermic hatchet that attaches to like a line and to herbicide. So when you run the hatchet, it'll inject essentially that herbicide into the tree. Or it can be as easy as just a regular hatchet and a spray bottle of herbicide, and you'll go around and you'll want to make several, because sometimes if you don't treat, and you want to make sure you go around the whole tree, because you can sometimes kill part of the tree and then it'll still have enough veins essentially in that one area that just half the tree will be dead. So you want to make sure you go around the entire thing. So, and just kind of a look at some of the herbicides that are out there for TSI action is, so glyphosate is very commonly used, triclopyr, picloram or plus 2,4-D, mazapyr, and then so the indicator dye. So you will sometimes buy these herbicides on their own, but and they aren't dyed. So Tordon is one I can tell you that they, like the RTU, it comes with colorant in it. But if it does not, it is helpful to put indicator dye in. So when you are thinning a lot of trees, it helps to know which ones you've treated and which ones you haven't. You can also add something called an adjuvant. So these are ones that just help with adherence of those herbicides to the trees. So, and then I have not updated these for this year, and that is something I will have to work on because the prices of a lot of herbicides have gone up, unfortunately. So again, probably one of the more expensive aspects of timber management is invasive species treatment and doing thinnings and treating those thinnings. So, and again, here's what's good for what. So glyphosate can be used for hack and squirt, cut stump, and girdle, and then also foliar treatments, which I have that on here because it's kind of I think taken probably from an invasive species talk, but most of our trees we don't when we're doing a thinning, they're not going to be small enough for us to do a foliar treatment to kill them, and we wouldn't want to. So when trees that we would be thinning out are leafed out, we would definitely not want to do foliar treatment on them because we would have a lot of other species that were leafed out around them. So it would be kind of too much spraying. It would not be responsible for us to do a foliar treatment. So we usually reserve the foliar treatment for treating our smaller species of plants and sometimes smaller shrubs. And we like to do that particularly for invasive species when the other species are in dormancy. And then here's our other ones. So triclopyr amine salt, and then this triclopyr ester. So this is a mixture of triclopyr, and then ester is our oil that it's going to use to adhere to the bark. So that's the one that we use for basal bark treatment. And then again, just kind of through the other ones. Good times to do this. So glyphosate is good winter, summer, and fall. In the spring, it does not work great because any of these methods, so hack and squirt, girdling, cut stump. So in the spring, we have a lot of sap flow, and so that's why none of these work great in the spring except for our basal bark spray there, triclopyr ester. And that is because of all that herbicide, all that sap flow. When we treat it, we cut it, it is going to have a lot of sap it pushes out. So when you put the glyphosate or the triclopyr or 2,4-D on it, it pushes it out, and we have a much lower kill percentage, which means that you've kind of wasted that money on herbicide, and then it didn't kill that tree. With any herbicide, read the label. So it's important to read it before you buy, before you mix and apply, and before you dispose of it. And I cannot emphasize enough wearing your personal protective equipment when working with herbicides. If you follow these rules and follow that PPE, this can be done safely. It's just important that you follow all those recommended precautions. And then again, like thinning is great for our forest, great for creating habitat, really good for timber production down the road. And again, it also can help with aesthetics. I know cutting trees is not everyone's cup of tea, but this can kind of improve overall forest health as well. So trees, just like us, just like other animals, when they're in really close contact with each other, insects, diseases, trees deal with a lot of fungi, and so all of those can lead to us losing a lot of trees in our forest because they get a disease and they spread it. So, and then just a fun firewood picture. So, and I think I saw one question in the chat, so I'm going to quit sharing and go back. And that was about interfering. So that was, I think I saw your question pop up when it talked about the little trees underneath of the big one. So depending on what species they are, but oftentimes if they are already, so if they're understory trees, they're not going to interfere because they're not usually going to grow any taller than our tree that's in the canopy. But the same can be said for if it's already an overtopped tree. So occasionally you'll walk through the forest and you'll see this tree that's kind of like zigzagged its way and it's kind of growing all sorts of directions. Those are usually trees that are already been suppressed. They've already been overtopped. And so they are not gonna, you're not releasing enough sun to them for them to make up and catch up with your tree that we consider your crop tree. Anything else, Sarah? When does spring start for an herbicide to work? So usually we just say not to spray well, I can tell you from my tree sugaring stuff that the sap is flowing pretty good right now on our warmer days. So if you cut on a cooler day, like today, for example, herbicide would be okay because your sap's not flowing and it would have time to absorb. But like next week, I saw some 60-degree days, and that is going to be really high sap flow. And so, but once we get past complete leaf out, then it would be kind of back to summer, and we won't have as much sap flow, making those herbicides work well again. So, and we don't, for some TSI, we will recommend herbicide, particularly if you're removing trees that have invasive tendencies or, we want to make sure that it stays thin for a while, but then sometimes we don't have to use herbicide. Just by cutting those competing trees, we'll let them kind of restart the regeneration process, especially if we're managing for things like deer and other wildlife. So deer actually, not only do they eat acorns and other things that we have in the woods, they actually, especially like this time right now when we have a snow cover on the ground, they will eat those seedlings as a food source. And so stump sprouting can provide quite a bit of food for those winter months in deer. Any other questions today about TSI? Yeah, no problem. And so just a reminder, no lunch and learns next week, and then we will start again the week after that. And I was gonna look at my flyer and let you know what's coming up. So March 7th, yep, will be spring invasive species management, because right now in March is a good time to get out there and spray things like winter creeper and honeysuckle, because they'll leaf out before our natives. So it's a good time to get out there for that. March 14th will be spring flower identification. March 21st, we'll be planting native plants with Katie Kamler. And then March 28th will be those poison plants and pests. And we'll talk about things to avoid in the woods. Oh, good question, Jen. Yes, you absolutely can interplant native fruit trees for habitat and animal boards. So especially a lot of our native fruit trees, they like pawpaws, they're great understory trees. So you can kind of plant those in between what you consider perhaps your timber crop trees or your larger oak trees as a good animal forage. Yep, absolutely. Yep, say this year it's a little challenge because the state nursery sold out of a lot of the fruit, like pawpaw, persimmon, and elderberry species like the first day. So if you can get your hands on them, it is great to plant them. Oh yeah, good. I'm glad to hear that. I need to post it to the Facebook page. I just saw a list of all the native plant sales that are coming up for the spring. I know we're having the Master Naturalist that I have in Rolla. I know they have one coming up this spring, but they're kind of listed all over the state. So I'll try to post those to the WOW Facebook page so you guys can see that as well if you're looking for native plants. All right. Have a great weekend.